have all airplanes out. It does it itself. Okay?
Yeah, you're right there with me though.
Every time I open the hangar door to go flying, I realize that I'm one of the lucky guys doing something that I dreamt of as a kid.
fly by itself. It does it itself. Okay?
Yeah, you're right there with me though.
Every time I open the hangar door to go flying, I realize that I'm one of the lucky guys doing something that I dreamt of as a kid.
Dick Rutan, U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, retired, 20 years active duty, soloed at 16, 325 missions in Vietnam. He is a founding member of the MISTYs, flying the F-100 as a forward air controller. He was shot down and rescued, highly decorated with 5 Distinguished Flying Crosses, Silver Star, 16 Air Medals, and the Purple Heart. He and Jeannie Yeager set the world record flying brother Burt Rutan-designed Voyager nonstop, unrefueled, around the world. 3 days and nights in a flying phone booth. Dick holds many other civilian speed and distance records.
84.
Oh, he's got 3 knots and he's got 4,000 feet to go.
87.
Still touching. There the wings come. She's gonna go. She's gonna go. Holy cow, look at that. Come on, Dick. Get it up. Woo-hoo! God, I thought it wasn't gonna do it, Mike. I don't believe it.
Added to the Air Force inventory in 1954, the F-100 North American Super Sabre was the first of the supersonic Century series of fighters introduced in the 1950s and 60s. It was the first U.S. Air Force aircraft to exceed Mach 1 in level flight. It was also the first aircraft employed by the Wild Weasels, whose crews used radar-seeking missiles to destroy enemy radar and surface-to-air missile installations. The two-seat F-100F also gained fame flying high-risk missions north of Vietnam's DMZ as a fast-forward air controller. The operation was known as Commando Sabre, and the F-100s used the call sign MISTY. Charles Boyd graduated from Air Force pilot training in 1959, and he soon found himself in the cockpit of the hottest fighter jet of the day, the F-100. On April 22, 1966, during his 105th combat mission, Boyd's F-105 was hit by anti-aircraft fire and he was forced to eject. He would spend the next 2,488 days as a prisoner of North Vietnam. Returning home in February 1973 as one of the POWs repatriated during Operation Homecoming, he chose to remain in the military. He had a 36-year-long career in the Air Force, retiring as the Deputy Commander-in-Chief of U.S. European Command in Germany. He is the only POW to attain the rank of a 4-star general. Dick Rutan grew up in an aviation-oriented family, and he spent his youth building model airplanes with his younger brother, Bert. Rutan's military career began at age 19 as an Air Force aviation cadet. He advanced into fighter aircraft, serving in Vietnam. In 1967, he volunteered to become one of the founding MISTYs of Operation Commando Sabre. It was high-risk flying. In the 3 years the MISTYs flew, 28% of them were shot down. Dick Rutan flew 325 combat missions over Vietnam, ejecting twice from Air Force aircraft during his career. He retired having been awarded the Silver Star, 5 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 16 Air Medals, and a Purple Heart. His time as a civilian has been equally celebrated. He received the Presidential Citizens Medal from President Reagan and the 1987 Collier Trophy for piloting the now famous Voyager experimental airplane on the only nonstop, non-refueled, around-the-world flight in history. Dean Cutter Cutshall of Fort Wayne, Indiana, acquired his North American Century Series fighter in 1996. Originally a U.S. Air Force aircraft, it served with the Turkish Air Force until the late 1980s when it was brought back to the U.S. Now immaculately restored in the markings of 6-time ace Francis Gabby Gabreski, the F-100F always wows during its rare airshow appearances. Warbirds in Review presents Dean Cutshall's F-100 and the American heroes General Charles Boyd and Lieutenant Colonel Dick Rutan.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm David Hartman. What a privilege to be with you all here today and for all of us to share in honoring our veterans, our active duty military, and the civilians who are so committed to maintaining the great history and the experiences of these patriots who defended our freedom and continue to do that today. Please welcome Dean Cutshall owns this beautiful airplane. Dean, good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Tell us about your airplane. How did you come by it?
Well, in 1992, John Dilly and I and my crew chief, Paul Swick, went to Tracor, which is in the Mojave Desert. It used to be called Flight Systems, and the airplane had been flown back from Turkey about 3 years before that. It was in terrible shape. I made a bid on it and didn't get the bid, unfortunately. About 4 years later, in '96, a gentleman in Texas, Dallas, Texas, called me and said, "Hey, are you interested in the F-100 still?" And I said, "Sure, we'd look at it." John and I and Paul went back to Dallas, Texas, and looked at the bird again and made the same offer we made to Flight Systems, and it was declined. About 6 months later, we get another phone call. It's a little more emergency now, and he says, "Hey, are you still interested?" And I said, "Well, maybe so." He said, "Well, come on down and let's look at it again." So we did. We looked at it. and there was a beautiful T-33 sitting next to it, pristine. And I looked at it and found out that the gentleman also owned the T-33. Looked at John and Paul, and I said, this might be a good deal. So I offered them the same amount that I originally offered him, and I said, I'll take the F-100 and the T-33. I got both airplanes. So it worked out well for me. I'm glad I waited 5 or 6 years. Brought it back to Fort Wayne, flew it to Fort Wayne, and flew it a couple times. Had some terrible problems with the airplane. Put it to bed for about a year and a half, and $600,000 later, and thanks to my crew chief, Paul Swick, and my engine man, Jim Presbendowski, we know him as Prez. This is what we have today, and it's absolutely beautiful. Prez put a new engine in it. We took the tail off. We took the engine out. We had the tail X-rayed. The slats, everything came off the airplane, and it was completely gone through. Fortunately, we live at a guard base that serviced the F-100s, and every night when I'd go out and take a look and see what was progressing, there the guard guys were. They loved the airplane, and they said, boy, this is great. We enjoy working on it. So that's how we came about the airplane. That's the reason it looks so pristine today. Thanks to my crew chiefs, Paul Swick and Prez, and Gordy's around here someplace too.
Dean, thank you very much, sir, and thanks for the airplane.
You're welcome.
You have a
Thank
good
you.
day.
Thank you.
Now, please welcome our guests, Dick Rutan and General Chuck Boyd. Gentlemen. General, start us off. You flew the F-100 before Dick did, back in the early 60s. What was your experience in the F-100? What was the airplane like, and when and where did you fly it?
Well, as I mentioned to Dick before, I think, first of all, it's the first fighter I ever flew. And I think most guys would tell you the same thing. The first one you fly, it's like your first woman. You may have better ones later, but that first one you're never going to forget. I got into the aviation cadet program as a youngster. I was a boy fighter pilot. Didn't have a college degree, but they had this wonderful program where if you could pass the quiz, you could get into flying training and officer training simultaneously. Shortly after I went through, they canceled that and they've never started it again. So timing is everything in life. The only thing I wanted to do was to fly airplanes. From the time I was 7 years old, got my first ride in a Piper Cub, and when I was a teenager, I read Jim Salter's book, The Hunters, and then I knew I wanted to be a fighter pilot. And so besides my parents, I guess they were the two most influential people in my life. The F-100, I did well in pilot training, got an F-100, went there. I knew about the F-100 from the time that it had first test flight, I think, in 53, and it was the first airplane to go supersonic level flight, and so on and so forth. So when I got a chance to go to Luke, to fighter gunnery school in that airplane, I was on the top of the world. I wouldn't have traded jobs for anybody in the world or any amount of money. And the airplane was everything I thought it'd be. It was. You had to take 6 rides in a 2-seater here before you could get in the C model. And the very first thing I did when I got in that C model is turn the mirrors in so I could see myself in the mirror and make sure that I wasn't having a dream. I took it up to Wickenburg. There's a little area up there that was supersonic. I rolled that rascal on its back and pointed it down and broke the Mach for the first time in my life. And I figured I had won the lottery of life.
So what about active duty, flying the airplane? What kind of missions? Where were you? Squadrons, assignments?
Well, maybe it's worth a minute to put this in some kind of context, and Dick will, I think, remember this, I guess, exactly the same. The period in the 50s was one of a drought for the tactical aviation community. The big choice in the early 51 between tactical and strategic air, strategic won for a couple of reasons. Kurt LeMay was a force of nature, and Pete Quesada, who was the tactical guy, well, he lost the toss, and they had one more 4-star billet, and Kurt got it. And he was a bomber guy, and he had a president starting in 52 or 53 who maybe the last one that was really fiscally responsible, and one of the ways he got that way was by limiting expenditures. And he knew he could have nuclear forces and with a deterrent effect that were cheaper than conventional forces. So the money went to SAC. The tactical outfit was hard up. And so a lot of us going through pilot training, and what was happening to kids, very often they go through gunnery school, but they didn't have an assignment, and they go to a GCI site, ground control intercept site, and which for a guy like that's fate worse than death. And that's what we all worried about. So, but when we finished, the times were changing a little bit. Some money was going into tactical forces, and I got an assignment to go to the Philippines. And we had paid homage to the nuclear missions by making these tactical airplanes mission nuclear capable, but so we had to do over-the-shoulder stuff and what have you. But we lived for flying air-to-air and air-to-mud. And this was a sweet airplane. It's the only one I knew, but as far as I was concerned, it was the best airplane in the world. A lot of people were thinking it was a dangerous airplane, and they built 2,294 of them, and 889 of them crashed, and a bunch of kids got killed in them. But for me, the airplane never did a bad thing to me. I never had anything ever happen to it, and I never even had a drag chute failure. It was a perfect airplane for me, and I'll love it till I die.
So you were in the Philippines, but also went to Europe also?
Well, not until I got into the 105.
Okay. But that was the extent of the F-100 experience.
That was the experience. When I left that operational tour in the 100, I said goodbye to that airplane. Never flew it again. Went to the 105 and.
So, Dick, best airplane you ever flew, or not? Do you agree?
It's the best airplane I ever flew, and for the same reason. Now, it had some quirky characteristics, but if you're a young fighter pilot, you take that on as a challenge. You didn't want to fly a mundane airplane. You wanted to fly this Hummer. But anyway, I got the same start that you did, and when I was a little kid and finally just grew up enough to look around, it was we were basking in the glory of the victory of World War II. And I look around and I just was fascinated about those guys that fought over Nazi Germany and the bombers and the P-51s, and I thought, I wonder if I could do that. Look at the courage. You're the only guy that comes back and a whole squadron is shot down. How in the world do you get in another airplane the next day and do it again? I couldn't imagine that people could actually do that. And it was a haunting thing all my life to find out whether in combat the little Dickie Rutan could do the same thing. Just wonder if it was up to it. And the very first time that this airplane was on public display was at Fresno Air Terminal, and he flew it up from LAX to the factory. And I stood underneath that beautiful snout right there as a little kid, and I looked up at that thing and I thought, wow, it isn't going to get any better than this. And I vowed to myself that someday I was going to fly that airplane and fly it in combat. And then there was one day, the day I'll never forget, just like you. I was standing in the Luke Officers Club, just having completed gunnery school in Luke. Now, if you want to be a real fighter pilot, the only way to get into that is fly F-100s at Luke, right, that gun school. And I was standing in the back of the corner. I just graduated from the gunnery school, and the debauchery that was going on in the club that night. There was guys coming back from Vietnam, and we were all eager, listening to the stories, and we were ready to go. And there was some, it was a little bit of drinking of alcoholic beverages, if I recall, and other activities. And pretty soon I found myself standing in the back of the room and overlooking this scene. And I thought to myself, I got orders to combat right in my pocket. And there was no place on planet Earth that I wanted to be and going to be. It was right there at that time. And I was going to find out whether Dickie Rutan could do that or not.
What year was that, Dick?
That was circa, my Vietnam tour was in 1967 and 1968 during the Tet Offensive.
Right. By the way, how many veterans are here? Raise your hands, please. How many vets? Yeah, great. So, Dick, you get Vietnam squadron, and you begin MISTYs. Is that when that started?
Well, that started, but a couple of things about this airplane that is kind of unique in itself. There was some really strange decisions made when this airplane first came into the inventory. Now, I can imagine that the Air Force was just thrilled to death. They were going to have a supersonic airplane at level flight. Wow. Now, in those days, we didn't have central air data computers and stuff. And North American told the Air Force, he says, hey, look, it's the pedostatic system. You know, they do not have a lot of experience in making a pedostatic system that would work. The big boom was going to help, but they said to the Air Force, now you can either have a pedostatic system that's accurate at slow speed, or you can have it accurate at supersonic speed. And so for some reason, somebody decided, wow, supersonic, that's really fast. The pilots need to know exactly what their altitude and airspeed is supersonic. Not even thinking that 1/10,000th of the flying time of all the F-100s would ever be supersonic. And so we found ourselves on GCA final approach, breaking out at minimums, 200 feet, and I'll never forget that the altimeter would unwind to 50 foot below the altitude. And we're doing at 500 knot laydowns, and the altimeter would be almost 2,000 feet in air. And if you would change back and forth a little bit, the altimeters would go all over the place. But boy, as soon as you went out of the Mach, it would swing around, whoop, and now we're accurate. Wow, we have accurate supersonic. Another thing, too, is that this is an airplane that actually has to be flown by the pilot. Wherever you move the controls, that's what the flight services do. Now, that's kind of strange to you F-16 guys, but the pilot actually had to move the controls and to move the control surface. Now, one thing about the F-100, it had a little directional problem, especially the early ones, right, the A models. And some guy was landed at Edwards Air Force Base, and he got it the nose high a little bit. And the burner at those days, they didn't light very reliably at high angles of attack. And he got in the classic saber dance, and I think every one of you has seen that. And I know when I went into gunnery school, they sat down and says, welcome to F-100 training. We got a little film we want to show you guys. And so we all got to sit there and watch the saber dance. But that was they tried to fix the tail and make it a little bigger and a little bit more rudder and try to refine that. But all in all, when you're in air-to-air combat, ACM and training, that the real good guys, they could pull the nose around and they can get it right on the very edge of a burble. And if you wanted to reverse course, you didn't do it with rudder, you just did it with, if you got to be careful, just a little opposite aileron and whap, you'd be around to the right side. And the adversary, he couldn't do that unless he was doing it just right. But what a fantastic airplane. Another thing is it had a hard light, the afterburner. And it had this squirrel cage. This is an afterburner that was stolen from an F-102, and they were very reliable. But the old squirrel cages, when that thing would light, if you had a lot of, kind of slow, a lot of angle of attack on the airplane, and you push it up to mill and put it out to burner, you'd always kind of hunker down like that. Because you could feel the engine, it would go, bam! And fire would shoot out the front, and dirt would fly up in your face, and you say, ooh, wow, that was really cool. So after a while, you got the thing that you could unload it to a lower angle of attack, and you put it out burn, but you put it all the way in min burner. And then you could feel the eyelids finally come open. Now they're open. Now you can gun it, and now you're in full afterburner. So it was really a strange, neat airplane.
So, get back to mission. Yes. John,
Let me add just one little thing to reinforce what
General.
Dick said. And that compressor stall required an underwear change. But in the quirkiness that he mentioned, you had to fly this airplane, I'm going to tell you a secondhand story, but it's one that really, I think, gets to the heart of it. Chuck Yeager was a squadron commander of the 1st Fighter Day Squadron at George, and he always flew the F model. I wasn't around, but some of my buddies were there. He always flew the F model, and everyone wanted to fly in the back seat with Yeager, because Yeager was, this giant of a fighter pilot and so forth. So my friend Buzz Byrne was in the back seat with him one day, and they go out and they shoot on the rag, and he shoots, he shoots better on the rag than anybody in the squadron ever thought about shooting. And they come back in and go into the traffic pattern, and he breaks, and he said, the needle, the vertical speed needle never moved a tiny bit. Down on downwind, bang, the gear down, turn base leg, perfect pattern, drops the needle to stay right there, comes around on final, most perfect traffic pattern you'd ever seen. And they get down and they get just about to touch down and they go boom, boom. So Yeager pulls the chute and holds the nose off for a while and drops the nose, turns off, and he says, I've flown 112 different airplanes, and this is the only son of a bitch I could never land.
So, Dick, back to Vietnam. Your missions. What were you flying?
Well, I flew the F-100. I got an assignment to Phuket, which is about halfway up between the South Vietnamese area. Phuket, what a neat name. Of course, we had a special adaptation to that name. But anyway, that was home to me. And you may have heard of Bud Day. I'm sure you've heard of Bud Day. Anyway, as a major, he was given the task to see if we could survive as forward air controller over North Vietnam. And it was very intense anti-aircraft fire with MiGs and SAMs and everybody shooting at you from small arms to SAM missiles. But we had a problem about finding targets up there and hitting them accurately. So they decided we're going to run a forward air control mission to see if it would work. And Bud Day was given that task, and he rounded up a handful of volunteers. And up until then, I was a single-seat, single-engine fighter pilot. And nobody wanted to fly a two-place airplane. Holy bananas, why would they want to do that? Anyway, I flew in country, single-seat a little bit, but I got really bored because I'm blue 14 on the edge of the formation. We come in at high altitude. There's a FAC down there, and there's all kinds of exciting things going on down there. And he marks it, we roll in, drop our bombs, and leave. And I says, wow, there's some exciting stuff going on down there. I'd like to be part of it and know more about it. Anyway, Bud Day and I, we went through the gunnery school at the same time, and he lived right next door from us there at Luke. And him and Dory, they had a couple of kids, little kids, and they had, he left me with a whole bunch of these cars. I mean, broken down cars. I said, how could a guy go to war and leave his wife with these horrible automobiles? And so I spent a lot of my spare time fixing Bud Day's junk cars that he left there. And so then when I got assigned to Phuket, I read, hey, Bud Day is here. And so I went running up. When I first got there, I went running up to the little MISTY outfit that was out in the back, little back corner in wing headquarters. And I come running in. I says, where the hell is Bud Day? I got a bone to pick with him. And very solemnly, they looked at me, and he says, Bud Day was just killed yesterday. And that was the acronym for being shot down. And I thought, my God, this is war. People really do get hurt.
MISTYs, where'd that name come from? What's it mean?
MISTY was the call sign, and it came from Bud Day, and I think he liked the song a lot. But then when I found out what they were doing up there, and our missions were about 6 hours long. We had our own dedicated tanker off the coast of North Vietnam, And we'd come up there and we would penetrate North Vietnam at low altitude right at dawn. And about an hour
How low altitude?
3,000 or 4,000 feet, sometimes lower. And it was really funny. You get up and you have a 1 hour intelligence briefing for the front seater, back seater. Now, the thing about the MISTY is we didn't have a pilot-co-pilot relationship. Every other mission we would swap front and back. The guy was in the back, he was the secretary, and he was really busy. He took all the film, he recorded all the sightings, all the visual reconnaissance things, he checked all the fighters in, he found out their ordnance, he briefed them on the target, and then the front seater actually marked the target and put them in, and then we give them their bomb damage assessment and sent them on their way. And a lot of times, the bomb damage assessment was none of your ordnance was within 10,000 meters of our target, no visible damage, have a nice day.
How'd you mark the targets?
Well, the F-100 was set up, we had 7 Willie Pete rockets on each outboard pylon. And it was, we could fire them singly, and there were white phosphorus. Call them Willie Pete's, and you'd fire this thing down, and it would glow with smoke for a while, and then you could mark them. But from, I wanted to go to MISTY so bad. I didn't want to be in country anymore. He says, well, you're a new pilot, and you can only be flight leads, can go there. I says, okay, what do I got to do to be a flight lead? He says, well, Rutan, you're a long ways from that status. It may take you 6 months to work to be a combat flight lead. But I kept bugging him and bugging him and bugging him, and finally the commander says, all right, God damn it, Rutan, we're going to give you a flight lead checkout. And so I went out, and I was no more qualified to be a flight lead, but I got the flight of 4 out, and we actually hit a target, and we came back, and he says, now get the hell out of here. I'm tired of you bitching about it. And I stayed in MISTY the whole time. MISTY had a very high loss rate. They only wanted people to stay there for 120 days. It was 3 months. And they figured that that loss rate was going to be reasonable, that nobody could, well, whatever, with a 28% loss rate, that's all they asked for. And it was supposed to be volunteers. I did my first 120 days, and I thought, wow, this is really exciting. And there was no fine way that I was going to go back busting trees and killing monkeys again. So I talked them into a second tour, and I got shot on my start of my third tour.
Describe that. What was the shoot down? How did it happen?
Well, I got in the way of a big anti-aircraft round one day. And it's ironic because then I bugged the 105 guys and I stole their patch. They got a really neat patch that says North Vietnam, 100 missions, and an F-105. Now, when I got shot down, I realized, wait a minute, I have 105 missions in an F-100. And so I took their patch and swapped the 0 and the 5 over, and I wear it. Now, all the 105 guys, they look at it, and it takes a long time for them to realize that it's 105 missions in an F-100, not the other way around. So we had a lot of fun with that.
You bail out?
Yeah, well, you ejected.
Ejected.
During the 105 missions as a MISTY, we would fly, our missions would be 4 and 5 hours at a time. We'd get up really early in the morning, about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, go through a 2-hour intelligence briefing about what happened there before, some of the targets that were struck at night, and so forth and so on. We'd record all that data. We'd go out and pre-flight our lone F-100 at Phuket in the early morning mist, and it was very quiet, just about an hour and a half before dawn, and every day at Phuket, a lone F-100F with a MISTY call sign would roll down the runway and climb into the mist of South Vietnam. And we'd fly up north, we'd rendezvous with our tanker off the coast, and then you want to do a random penetration every day. But after a while, they got to know who we were, and they didn't mess with us a whole lot. Because my personal philosophy is, if you're a good gunner and you shoot at me, I'm going to come back and frickin' kill you. Now, when that happened, now there was a lot of gunners up there, and since you're up there a half a day every time in your area, you know where all the gun crews were, and we'd all give them grades about how good they were. And in the really bad gun crews, we'd fly over and drop them candy and deliver their mail and stuff. But every once in a while, there'd be a good one, and they would lead you just right, and the tracers or the 37 millimeter would come by the cockpit so close that you could feel the shock waves coming off. And then you'd roll back, and there he was, and it's a classic ring floating off this gun sight. And I thought, well, you son of a gun, or words to that effect, and I'd orbit up over him, And I'd try to get some F-105s from the Alpha Strike Force that were going into Hanoi, or scramble the gunfighters out of Da Nang. And I thought, that guy is good. And I always wondered what it would feel like orbiting just out of range over them. And they knew what the drill was. And pretty soon there'd be 4 other fighters join me in the orbit. And they knew that if the MISTY marked them, they were probably in for a lot of hurt. Now, the excitement to do that, and you think, okay, you're going to roll in, and the MISTY rolls his wings over, and he pulls his nose down. And at that time, you're pointed right at the gun sight for just a handful of seconds. And they don't have any lead trajectory. They don't have to do anything but shoot right back directly at you. Before, we were jinking all the time, and they have to lead you. And that was a challenge. But for this handful of seconds, they knew that if that guy marked them, they were gone. And as soon as you roll the wings over and start the nose down, the whole place erupted with all kinds of tracers coming by. And I was thinking about when I was a little kid, I had the courage to get up on the high dive board and walk out in the end and look down. You know, the feeling that you had the first time? Well, I had that feeling every time it rolled in. And boy, was this exciting. And you hold it up, you try to mark them so the smoke would billow and billow over the gun sight. So when Lead rolled in with his bombs, they had some obscure. And then Lead would come down, drop his bombs. We'd come back and do an opposite direction and try to draw some fire with number 2 down the chute. And so for a handful of minutes, it was really exciting doing gun kills. And I loved it. And you could see a big stick of daisy cutters come off of an F-105 one day. And you see them come off, and you see the gun sight just firing like mad. And they come down, and they come down, and they come down. And then all of a sudden, they just blow the crap out of them. And I'd come by in a low pass, and you could see guns laying on their side and stuff. And I'd pull off and do a roll, and it says, well, fool around with a MISTY, you. And I said, and anyway, the word got around quite a bit, and we had a relationship with them, and they really didn't mess with us a whole lot, sometimes. But every once in a while, they were trying to protect something, and you come over the horizon, and the whole place would light up, and they would just draw you to a target. What are these guys protecting this morning? And so we'd sniff around and find it. Aha! Call the gunfighters, call the thuds out of Thailand. We got us a good target. But man, it was exciting.
How were you rescued? How were you evacuated after you ejected? And were you over the north or the south?
Oh, no, I was over the north. I flew a few missions in the south. That's not where the action was. But the majority of it was, I was the second guy to fly 100 MISTY missions. Nobody had ever done that before. Eben Jones was the first guy to do that. And I flew 105. That was 105 that day. And we went up and checked out the F-4 Phantoms. Ever heard of an F-4 Phantom? Double ugly. God. Anyway, I was going to go up and check them out in Da Nang, and so I went up there one day, and they were flying the same MISTY profile. Went up, refueled, and now that ugly smoking F-104 or F-4 came down the same place that we did every morning, or randomly, and then they didn't know. They said, hey, that's not a MISTY. We got to shoot him. And the whole mission, they shot the crap out of us. And I kept screaming, it's a MISTY, you guys. It's a MISTY. Quit shooting at me. Anyway, that wasn't a whole lot of fun. But that one day in late September of 1986, we were in on a truck.
66?
What'd I say?
86. But, yeah, go ahead.
19, I got Voyager mixed up. 1968.
Okay.
Up the Quang Key River Valley, about 30, 40 miles. We put a flight of fighters in on this truck that we needed to kill, and they all missed. And every once in a while, the MISTY would just say, the guys went up there 2 or 3 flights, miss everything. And we weren't supposed to do that. And so we'd come back around, and I'd strafe with our cannon here, I'd strafe 3 or 4 trucks and pull off. But then I couldn't take credit for it. I'd happen to give it to the guys that couldn't hit the ground, barely. I says, oh, by the way, guys, I'm going to add 3 trucks to your kill so you can take that home. And their ordnance never came anywhere close. But and this day, those guys all missed. And for some reason, we kind of broke a rule, and the guy was with, his name is Chuck Shaheen, and he was finishing his first tour. And we were high school guys in the same area. I says, hey, Chuck, this is your Champagne mission. Why don't I go with you? And I thought we were going to have a little thing in the Orange Cove Register that said, 2 local boys finished last mission. And so I went with Chuck on his last mission. And we went down, and we tried to do a angle strafe. And we looked around, and he thought, that damn truck. And so Chuck got right down in the weeds, which violated all the rules that we're supposed to. at about a 2-degree angle strafe pass, and I was looking around the corner, and Chuck opened fire and blew the hell out of the truck. And when he pulled off, bang, fire. Ripped a big hole in the belly right underneath my seat. We started dumping fuel out like mad, and it was torching, burning. Now, I always thought the F-100 could give me 20 seconds of flying. Every time I rolled in, it says, where's 20 seconds that I can go to bail out and hopefully get rescued in some way, or the jungle, or maybe get feet wet. And I pulled up on fire, burning like mad, and I looked around, and it was just a coastal plain, and there was no way that you were going to land in that area and not get captured. And then we started turning towards the coast, and I could see the coast way over there. And I looked at the total fuel gauge, and the total fuel gauge was unwinding because we're just dumping fuel like mad. And you look at the coast, and you look at the total fuel gauge, and you say, there's no fine way we're going to make it. And then Chuck says, well, why don't we light the afterburner? And we talked about that with the guys around us, and they says, well, it may blow up. See, it's got fuel all inside. But then I thought about prisoner of war and all those bad people down there that were really mad at us, and I thought, Chuck, why don't we give it a shot? And so the guys that were on our wing, we talked about that, and the next thing I know, they were up in front of us looking back at us. And so we gritted our teeth and closed our eyes, pushed it up and lit the burner, and it didn't blow up. So we used the fuel instead of torching to use it for acceleration, and at 1.3 Mach at about 15,000 feet, 15 miles from the coast, the old F-100 flamed out. And she did a nice parabolic arc over the coast and a perfect controlled ejection. And ejected, got in the raft, got picked up by the Jollies, wrapped up, because I knew when we're on fire, and I made a thing to myself, nobody had flown more missions. Nobody had more time over North Vietnam than I did. And when we pulled off, and I says, if I can just get out and I can get rescued, I am not coming up here again. I can get to see my kids, and I didn't really think I'd ever get to do that. Anyway, sure enough, ejected, went down on the raft. A couple, 3 hours later, the Jollies come picked us up. And I was so relieved after that. I wrapped up in a blanket in the back of the Jolly Green, and an hour-and-a-half flight back to Da Nang, I went to sleep.
Wow.
I was going home.
General, F-105, Thuds. Where did it get that name, Thud?
Well, they were crashing quite a few of them, and they go thud when they hit the ground.
I didn't think you'd ever admit that. That's what the F-100 guy said.
So what were your missions? You were flying out of where, Thailand?
Yes, I was flying out of Karat on the. Well, I've been in and out of Thailand, starting actually in the 100 days, well before the war. But by the time I went back there, PCS, I was flying out of Karat, and we were doing bombing missions mostly on assigned targets in various places in North Vietnam. Some
General.
road reconnaissance.
Right up in.
All right.
There you go.
Some road reconnaissance missions, but mostly fixed target missions.
Right. We've heard that the Vietnamese seem to know where you were coming and when you were coming. How accurate is that?
Well, there are a lot of theories on that they had help from our own government. I've never bought that theory, but that's a widely held view. There are rumors that the 7th Air Force was infiltrated and they were getting the frags information. I don't know that that's true, but what I do know is that if they were important targets, it seemed like they really had a lot of capability there to be shooting at us. And I do know that we on some important things that needed to be done that any competent commander would insist upon doing, we were forbidden from doing. For example, we sat and watched the SAM sites being built. I say watched by reconnaissance photography. And we were forbidden to go in and strike those targets that were under construction. until they were fully operational, and then we were allowed to go at a point where it was a dicey business to be doing.
Have you any idea what the reasoning was behind keeping you from blowing them up while they were being built?
It seemed to be that we only wanted to aggravate them up to a certain level. Or other theories were there are a lot of Soviet guys that are on those sites doing the construction, and we didn't want to kill any of them. But I really don't know. I think we had a massively incompetent White House at the time who really didn't know how to conduct a war, and a lot of kids didn't come home as a result.
Yeah, a lot of the guys, we'd fly up there and they'd have bombing halts. And I spend a lot of time trying to find the hidden trucks and all the truck parks during the day. And then that individual in the White House to say, well, we're going to have a bombing halt. And they'd all come out and they'd line up. There'd be hundreds of trucks lined up. And we'd circle over there and couldn't even touch them. Over Haiphong Harbor, the shipping in Haiphong Harbor, the majority of them were British registered ships in Haiphong Harbor. They were unloading SAM sites. And you're exactly right. They weren't allowed to hit them because there's a Russian down there. And then when the Russians left, then they could shoot, and then we can bomb them afterwards. I had an F-1 of your colleagues down. His name was Scotch 03. Shot down in the jungle, and we were talking to him, and we were trying to do the rescue forces, and the Jolly Greens would come up, and they couldn't cross the border. And I was really, really upset about that. And I said something kind of bad about them, not knowing the fact that they couldn't cross the border because there was some snot-nosed kid in the basement of LBJ's White House who was asleep, and nobody wanted to wake this son of a gun up to get permission for the Jollies to come in and pick up one of my fellow warriors.
General, you were shot down and captured. How did that go?
Well, not real well. I was on a SAM suppression mission that day, and we had F-100 F model wild weasels. Later on, there were Thud weasels, but at that time they were 100. So to be one F-100 weasel with the most sophisticated gear we had at the time, anyway, the sensor equipment, and 3 strike aircraft. And we'd go up there and troll for these guys and see if we get them to shoot missiles and figure out where the sites were. And that's what we were doing that day. And then one of them stuck a couple of them up my direction, and so I saw them come off the ground, and it's a pretty easy thing to just duck them, just dive into and just turn into them, and the closure rate was such that they weren't going to go off until you were past. So I did that, and I went down and came back up to roll in. I had rocket pods on, and got hit with flak on the top of the pop. It might be interesting for you to know that we were developing tactics in those days. This was early on, and we hadn't practiced a lot of this sort of thing before the war. And we developed a technique which also became, in a certain way, which I'll try to explain, the creed, I think, of the fighter pilot of the day. We'd go in, running in low and fast, very fast. That airplane was really fast. And the leader's job was to find the target, and the wingmen were to protect these flanks. And when the leader found the target, he'd call it, and then he would turn left or right 30 degrees or so, and we'd fall in behind in extended trail, and then he'd pop. pop up to 7, 8, 9,000 feet and roll in, and we would come around, the wingmen would come around in sequence. Now, coming down the chute, there are 4 things really that had to happen in space and time with great precision. One was dive angle. And it could be anything. We used 45 for the most part, but as long as you knew what you were going to use and set your bomb sight accordingly. And then airspeed to arrive at a predetermined altitude, at a precise airspeed, at a precise dive angle, and with an offset aim point that we determined on the basis of winds. Now, those are the things you had to do. The thing that you couldn't do if you wanted to be successful, and this, if you want to know the soul of the fighter pilot, I think it's defined right here. What you couldn't do coming down that chute was to jink, was to move around, to make yourself more difficult to hit for those shooting at us. And there were a lot of people shooting at us. And so we said, and this is what we taught, and this is what we believed, from the top of the pop to bomb release, son, your ass belongs to Uncle Sam.
When you were picked up by the North Vietnamese, where did you go? Where did they take you?
Well, they took me to stripped me and down to my shorts and had me bound up pretty tight and took me off to a little hut someplace. I have no idea where I was. I know where I was when I was shot down, but they took me someplace and put me in a hut and kept me there until dark. And then got me out and put me in a truck and a blindfold on, and we bounced around for a while, and I ended up at a place that I didn't know then, of course, but later on knew to be the old French prison called Wallow, which we called over the years the Hanoi Hilton. And then there was a welcoming committee to make sure that we were comfortable over the next few days. And when they got through with that, then they put us in a little place called, that I learned was called the Heartbreak Hotel. 7 cells in a little cell block inside the Hanoi Hilton, and the first contact I had with another American was Robbie Reisner, who was in the cell across the way, and he had been there a while, so he knew what the schedule was for the guard change and so forth, and when he had a little period of time, he could get down and whisper under this old iron door, which he did, and made contact with me, and gave me my instructions, welcoming me in a better way than the Vietnamese had. But he was a commander, and I want you to understand this. He had command leadership oozing out of his pores, and the job that he did over the years was, I just don't know how anybody could have done it any better. He managed to, by the time he was shot down, he had a pretty ragtag bunch of guys there, had any kind of organ, to be separated, of course, but they didn't have any real sense of organization or set of instructions on. I mean, everybody knew the code of conduct, and everybody tried to adhere to the code of conduct, but there's a point at which you can't maintain that. And so he had a set of instructions. His influence spread by word of mouth and so forth, by using the tap code, and that's what he taught me that day. He says, you got to learn this. And he told me how it worked. He said, practice it in your head. Practice it. This is vital for survival. He said, eat whatever they give you. No matter how disgusting it is, it'll keep you alive, and on and on. And he really gave me the set of instructions that were the real guideline for behavior in prison.
Jim Stockdale, Admiral Stockdale, is quoted as saying that there was no way anybody could totally beat the ropes. How accurate was that for you?
It was certainly accurate for me, and it was accurate for everybody. The point is, and this is what's really important, I can break any man with a little time and not kill him. But willingness to take it again and again and again is the trick. What they want to do is they break you and make you a malleable unit then that will comply with what they want you to do. So to maintain your dignity, to maintain your self-worth, you have to be able to say, I'll do it again. You're never going to get me to that point. I'll do it again, and you'll break me, but you won't keep me broke.
How do you explain to yourself how you and all your compadres, the hundreds and hundreds of you, that you, or most of you, maintained yourselves, maintained what you just described, and were able to come out alive?
Well, this is a subject I don't spend much time talking about, but I'll tell you one thing, that I was at the Air Force Academy many years later and speaking with a bunch of cadets, and one of them asked me, how do you prepare for that kind of an experience? And I don't know why I said this exactly. I said it without thinking, but I said the best way is to have a good mother. I think I'm not sure everybody tell you that, but I think there's something about American character, and you get it at home. And the kind of guys that we were, that kind of slice of life in our country, were the kind of guys that had that kind of character. I think there's another aspect, and it was an even better part of it, and I think Dick would probably agree. There's something about the solo mentality of the fighter pilot that I do this all by myself. I don't do things by committee. And it's up to me. What happens in here is up to me. It matters to me. I matter to it. And that's, I think, helpful in getting through a difficult experience. Self-worth, self-responsibility. And that's a characteristic that you find, and I'm sure it's the same. I haven't flown with any of those kids today, but I'm sure it's the same today. Kids flying F-22s and what have you. It's a matter of character. Starts with your mother, and it ends up in the acculturation process of the fighter pilot.
Dick?
Yeah, it's the character. And real quick little statement. It's a character of who we are. They say, well, he's a hero. Look how brave he is. And that's not the case at all. It's a normal, typical, freedom-loving person who rises to the occasion when they're faced with that. You think, well, I could never be a hero. And I say, BS, you could be a hero. If that situation came up, it would. And in fact, the time that America was attacked since Pearl Harbor, the worst attack on 9/11. Now we have multi-billion-dollar carrier groups and Air Force fighter wings with all kinds of technology, and Marines and Army divisions and stuff, all that to protect us on that day. And if you think about this hero thing, he said that 25% of that attacking force on that day was not taken out by any of these multi-billion-dollar military things. They were taken out by a handful of people on their way to vacation in California. And that epitomizes the whole thing about the character of who we are and the fact that we revere that flag. And on the Vietnam thing, there was something happen. Of course, I was almost there many times, but I tell you what, there was nobody more interested to see these guys, these heroes of mine, get off the airplane there at Clark in 1973. Is that right? Okay. When they got off, and there was one particular individual that walked off the airplane, and the gentleman is not with us any longer, but his name is Jeremiah Denton. Maybe you heard it, and I think that all of you may have heard that word. And he was on the C-141 at Freedom for the first time, and he stepped down those stairs, and all the people there that would to greet him. And what he said was so profound that I can't even say it without crying, because it epitomizes what these individuals did to return with honor, and to think about what they had gone through all those years. And Jeremiah Denton walked up to the microphone and he said, "I consider it an honor to have had the privilege of serving my country under difficult circumstances." And I just can't imagine how lucky we are to have people like that considers that a privilege to be able to go through something like that. God bless you and your comments.
Jerry's speech is the best speech I ever heard.
That's right.
Ladies and gentlemen, General Chuck Boyd and Dick Rutan. Dick has written a wonderful autobiography. You just saw a slide about it up there a couple of minutes ago. So we're here to build excitement about reading Dick's book. It's really a wonderful book about his career. Hi, how are you?
Pretty good, David.
Good.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Hey, look at all these smiling people here.
Yeah.
I don't see any umbrellas.
No.
They're very courage.
Don't say it. Don't say it. But we're here today to talk about Voyager, because last year we talked about Sandy's and all of that, but this year we want to talk about Voyager. Dick, what was the goal of Voyager when you and Bert first thought about it? What was the goal?
The primary goal, and it turned out to be the major motivation that kind of sustained us for 5.5 years, is to be a milestone and be first to fly unrefueled around the world, nonstop, non-refueled. And we kind of looked at that as obviously a major milestone, but maybe the last one, arguably an atmospheric flight. And so that's that motivation. And all the trials and tribulations that we had during the 5.5-year odyssey to do this, to maintain the motivation, all I had to do was I'd go out in the Mojave airport on the ramp and sit with my back up against the hangar all by myself. And I'd close my eyes and put my head back a little bit. And I try to imagine what it would feel like to land at Edwards Air Force Base having accomplished aviation's last first. And then I let that settle a little bit and let that permeate into my psyche. And I decided that would feel pretty darn good. And so whatever the problems were, I could just get up and just hammer at it again.
So how accurate is it, the thought that you and Dick, you and Bert were sitting in a coffee shop or restaurant and he sketched it out on a napkin? Is that accurate?
No, that's accurate. In fact, most great airplanes start either in a restaurant or in a bar with a drawing on a napkin. That's kind of traditional. But Bert had been thinking about this, and he realized that we now have available the material that's going to make a transglobal flight unrefueled possible. That's carbon fiber. And he says that with carbon fiber, it is now possible for the first time to design, build an airplane capable of 29,000 statute miles unrefueled range.
Wow. How much did it go from the napkin to the realization of what he had to do in terms of design to make that happen, even though he understood carbon fiber could potentially make it happen?
Well, up until it's a good question. Up until the time we met in the restaurant, he never put pen to paper or even worked out any kind of numbers and, all the formulas those genius designers use to do airplanes. He never did any of that. And this was kind of a concept that he had in his mind. And thank goodness the Voyager ended up to be looking nothing like what he drew on the napkin that day.
Oh, really? So you said a couple of times 5.5 years. From napkin to takeoff in December of '86, it was 5.5 years?
It was, right at 5.5 years. And Bert thought it would take, in fact, he said, Dick, why don't you do this Voyager thing? And it's going to take maybe 18 months, and then you can go on with something more useful in your life. Holy bananas.
So, but what besides the design, what were the biggest challenges for you and Gina in the whole process to get to where you could actually fly the airplane?
Well, initially, everybody's concerned about the performance and the structures and the handling qualities and any concern that you have on another airplane. And we knew this airplane had to be extremely compromised as far as systems reliability, handling qualities, stability and control, structural margins. Where most airplanes are designed, that most of them that we fly, they are designed for an ultimate yield. That's when you pull it enough, when the wings will break off between 5 and 6 Gs. The Voyager, when we took off, for the first 3 days, we had a structural limit, G-wise, of 1.3 Gs. And that meant just a very little tiny turbulence of any kind would actually break the wings off.
So in December, when you took off, what was the date? December?
It was December 14th.
14th. So what were the last surprises when you got in the plane that day, if there were any last surprises?
Well, another thing that we didn't realize, human factors. How difficult this was going to be physically and also mentally. And if we hadn't have learned some of the things the hard way, unfortunately, the flight of the Voyager would have failed due to human factors. And to a fighter pilot, to fail in front of the whole world and say, hey, I quit, I'm tired. I'd rather cut off both legs with a dull paring knife than do that. But there were some things that were so challenging, they were really beyond our control.
Including?
Well, one is One is fatigue, obviously, and some other things that we kind of learned the hard way. When we brought the first Very Easy prototype to Oshkosh in 1974, I set a world distance record between here and Menominee, Wisconsin. And we flew most of the day and set a light category record. But then we flew some other distance records. In fact, those records that we set in the late 70s, when I first got to Mojave from the Air Force, they still stand today. And one of them was a non-stop, non-refuel flight, and it was from Anchorage, Alaska. Just think about this. Anchorage, Alaska. This is non-stop, non-refueled, all the way down across. We went from Alaska to Canada to North Dakota to Atlanta, Georgia to Cape Canaveral, Florida, out over the ocean, and all the way down the last island in the British West Indies chain, which was Grand Turk. And that flight took right at 30 hours, non-stop, non-refuel. But the first one we set, it was a close course distance record, and it was between Mojave, there in the high desert where we live, up north, up to by the Sierra Nevada, Mount Whitney, and so forth, up to Bishop. And we did that for 33 and a half hours. And that was exactly to the minute that Lindbergh's flight was from New York to Paris. And it was no help. It was all hand-flown. And
how did that affect you as an experience, that kind of time?
Well, we really learned a lot about that. Because, here the guy that got on that airplane that morning, he was one of these arrogant fighter pilots. Hell, I could do anything. I never thought about any human factors or that Dick Rutan would be any way challenged to do that. Holy bananas, what I surprised. Because that night before takeoff, we had some maintenance on it. And Bert really didn't want to, he wasn't interested in records, but I kind of was. And I took his old prototype, and we had some magneto change. And basically, I was working up through midnight to fix this thing. And then we were supposed to get up an hour before dawn so we could weigh the airplane and have it certified and fuel it and get in and do all those certification things. And so I really didn't hardly sleep at all. I was kind of nervous about the big flight coming up, and woke up maybe an hour earlier than I should have. But basically, I was up all day, and only a couple of hours before I took off. We checked in, and the similarities between Lindbergh it was incredible, because he didn't sleep before either. And we showed up to take off just right at dawn, and fueled the airplane and took off and started shuttling back and forth. I guess the daytime wasn't too bad, but when the sun went down, then the fatigue really hit me bad. I started to hallucinate, started to see gremlins talking to me, sitting on my canard, telling me they're going to kill me. But another thing we learned about was sensory deprivation. When you're really busy, like if you're busy doing something that's exciting, and if you're involved in a very pleasurable experience, let's say, time goes by just like that, damn it. But then if it's boring and something you don't like, time progresses agonizingly. Like if a truck rolls up on your legs and you're in excruciating pain, a minute seems to be a lot longer than it used to be. So we learned about how to handle fatigue based on how you process time.
All right, to what extent did this translate over to Voyager from 33 hours to 3 days and nights?
Well, the thing that we learned about that, and we learned the hard way, when I landed after that, I was talking to demons, and I was talking to war, and trying to stay awake, and smelling salts. And
when you were in the airplane?
Yeah, when in the airplane during the flight. And I couldn't believe it. This guy come and sat on my canard, a little black guy. I mean, not a Negro guy, but he was a black elf with the meanest looking face you can remember. And if my canopy hadn't have been there, I could have reached out and grabbed him by the neck. And he was telling me, "You're already dead, Dick. You've already dead." And he described in detail the crash. And he says, now, everybody that dies on planet Earth, this is perfectly normal, that they all feel this way. It's your home. You're reluctant to go. You don't know what, you don't know where he wants to take you, and you're uneasy about that. He said, it's okay, just relax, go to sleep and come with me. And I tell you what, I had to dig awful deep not to go with him that night.
So how many hours were you flying before you gave up the seat to Gina, who didn't have nearly your flying experience?
No, Gina did not have, unfortunately, that experience. And that was a big problem. There was training issues. Everybody knew that Gina had to do a lot of training. I mean, to be even a reasonable co-pilot for this thing. You know, ideally, Dave, if you and I were going to fly this mission, I have.
Well, of course, you and I would not have fit in that cockpit together.
That's a metaphor, okay. But just to make the point, I have a lot of confidence in your experience. And I know when you're sitting up there driving the airplane that you can handle whatever comes up equally as well as I can. Now, you have a confidence that, and then you can lay down and you can actually go to sleep. But you have to, and then we'd swap positions, and then the other pilot could sleep. But the problem with Gina, she couldn't do any of that stuff. So to answer your question in a minute, when I put her in the seat, and I realized that even if the autopilot kicked off, we're going to lose the airplane. So now that's a high level of anxiety when you're laying back there, and you're a good maybe at least 30, 35 seconds from the controls, and the airplane will come apart in about 15 seconds when it starts uncontrollable pitching. That anxiety level, it really makes it, you got to be really tired to go to sleep. But to answer your question specifically, and we did not know how we were going to handle any of that on the takeoff. In fact, I was talking to Bird and the ground crew, and they says, hey, you just can't do that. There will be a failure for the because of crew fatigue. And they were probably right, I guess. But in any case, we took off. And now for 5.5 years I've been working on. I mean, this is the opportunity to hang my airplane in a nice museum and give talks and have the honor of meeting David. See? Or y'all, really. So we took off, and I thought, well, we'll just handle it the best we can. But to answer your question, I spent the first day, the first night, the second day, the second night, the third day, and the third night, and the fourth day. And I was going to go into the fourth night and said, I can't do the 4 nights.
So you flew that all?
Yep. I sat in the seat for, 3 nights. But the evening of the fourth day, I was looking at the fourth night, and I said, I don't care how arrogant you are and how great you think you are. There was no fine way you're going to be able to go 4 nights in a row. It just can't be done.
And where were you in the flight? You flew to the west. How far had you gotten at that point?
Okay, we'd gone through Hawaii, and we were just going feet dry into the Philippines. But and I had a protocol. I would never put her in the seat at night, because if she could see outside, maybe she could fly it visually, hopefully. But at night, I just thought there was really no way that she could do that. And so, but all day long, we're fighting weather and fine-tuning it and talking to people and I mean, really busy. But the neat part of the workload on the Voyager was just exactly right. Because if the workload was easy and there was nothing to do, I'd become bored. Remember how you pass the time? And so if you're busy, you're doing something interesting, and you're fine-tuning this thing and looking out for the weather and the winds and communicating with mission control, it's a perfect combination of being busy to control. The biggest problem we had is the perception of the passage of time and how you control that. Like this close course distance record when I had the hallucinations and stuff and no sleep the day before. The second one, we went to Alaska, and we're going to fly to the British West Indies nonstop. Only that one, I was smart that time because I got a whole bunch of sleep, and I knew I was going to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so I changed the circadian rhythm, and I went to bed at 6 o'clock every night for about a week up there. They all went out to dinner, and they're going to movies, and I have to go home and go to sleep because I was bound and determined I was going to get a full night's sleep. And then on that flight, it was to control the passage of time. And every time I would get bored and we feel that the time is slowing down a little bit, we had a little tape recorder, and I'd record some really melodramas. Now, us graybeards, we can remember the thing about the little melodramas on the CBS radio mystery hour, The Shadow Knows. And if you get bored a little bit, you just pop in one of those things, and you're listening to it. You're involved in following the little melodrama, and before you even know it, 20 minutes have gone by, and it's not fatiguing. Stuff like that. And we flew all day and all night and landed just before dark at Grand Turk, and the governor came out to meet us. He was really a nice guy, and I crawled out of the airplane, and I felt great. I just felt like I'd had a full night's sleep. I was rested, happy, went out to dinner with the governor, and went to bed normally. So we knew something. We learned something really vital.
Well, when you further on, whoops, here comes an airplane. Mosquito.
Beautiful.
That's coming. Mosquito's coming next. At what point did you finally get to sleep and get some real sleep, and for how long?
Right. What we did up until then, I'm not saying I stayed awake for 3 darn nights. I was sitting in the seat, and I would take a cat nap. 5 minutes. I said, Gina, give me 5 minutes of sleep. So she'd stop the watch, and her job was to wake me up in 5 minutes. And that helped a lot more than I thought it was going to do. I said, well, I'm reasonably refreshed. It helped. I don't feel, even after 5 minutes of sleep, I felt a lot better than I did before I went to sleep, sitting in the seat. But the funniest thing happened is when you go to sleep, you're sitting there flying, and then you want to close your eyes, and when you close your eyes, your head falls over. And when you do that, the intercircular canals will feed information into the brain. And every time I would close my eyes, the Voyager would pitch up like that and start to do a half roll. And I'd open my eyes, nope, we're straight and level. What the hell is going on? And so then you do that 3 or 4 more times, and you know the airplane is pitching up and rolling like that. And then you just fight your way through it. No, I'm not going to wake up. I got to sleep. And then every time I'd move my head, the headset would give a different vibration. And it would sound like a main bearing is going, oop, what's that noise? And so you go through all those iterations before you can actually go to sleep. But after about the 3rd day, I could take a Slortnet cat nap in the seat, and she would wake me up. And when I'd wake up, I had absolutely no idea where I was. I looked around, where the heck am I? What are all these gauges up there? My hand? What does all this mean? And I literally, mentally had to go all the way back to Edwards Air Force Base and remember that I took off and I flew, and now we're in Hawaii and Guam, and then catch up, and okay, now I can do it. But then we were going to do a test, and I says, can I wake up quick enough to be useful consciousness, I guess the term, to useful consciousness. If I'm asleep and the autopilot kicks off and the airplane starts porpoising, I got 15 seconds to fix it. 15 seconds is when it comes apart. Can I wake up in 15 seconds to be useful conscious? And the horror was, as I got into this thing, I'd wake up and it took about 30 to 40 seconds to get there. So now what are you going to do? So anyway, I got out of the seat for the first time going into the Philippines, and there was still bad weather. It wasn't really good weather, but I thought, I can't do another night. And so I crawled out of the seat and let Gina fly, or sit and watch the autopilot. And I think I laid out for the first formal sleep, and it was about an hour and a half. And then we had a mechanical failure we had to fix. So it seems like every time I got down in the back, something really bad happened.
But when you finally woke up and got back in the seat, were you rested enough to keep it together and not have the dashboard bulge and all of that stuff?
Well, the dashboard bulge was high altitude due to hypemic hypoxia. And that was hypoxic altitude, and that was a really bad thing. But then, even an hour and a half, all of a sudden, she woke me up, and the attitude indicator had failed. I looked at the attitude indicator, and it was wings level. Then I looked out the 2 windows, and we're banked. And I know we were screwed then. But the attitude indicator was a critical part of the autopilot. And fortunately, because I had doubts about an electric gyros, they'd have high failure rates. And we did bring it back up, thank goodness, or else the mission would have ended there in the Philippines. Anyway, we changed that out. And then when I turned the radio on to listen, the Philippine controllers were apoplectic with anger. Because
what were they upset about?
Well, I turned it over to Jane and I said, here's air traffic control, talk to them, tell them what they want, where we're going and so forth. Do pilot things on the radio. She wouldn't talk to anybody. She never talked to anybody. And when I finally woke up and got on the radio again, boy, they were upset. And rightfully so. But I knew that if they weren't going to shoot me down, I would be out of Philippine airspace in 3 or 4 hours. And if they were upset, they can send me a postcard to Mojave.
What happened when you got over the mountains of Africa?
The Africa crossing. We were outside of our weather window. We had missed it because of a propeller failure. And the weather department guys, they told me that we were too late and we missed the favorable weather window to go around the world. And so I'm so tired and frustrated and no money and trying to make sure the volunteers show up, and it was just really getting to me. And so I says, Lynn, look, here's what it is. I says, you go back in your weather department and you find me a way around the world. Now, the airplane's not ready yet, maybe a handful of days, but when it's ready, I'm going to open the door, I'm going to walk outside and look up. If it's raining, we'll wait till it stops raining. And as soon as it stops raining, we're going to take it over to Edwards Air Force Base and we're going to fly around the world. And so he went back and came back and said, yeah, Dick, I found another way. Except, I can't get you across Central Africa. And so I got a world map out, big world map, California, Europe, all the way to Asia, big map. And I noticed that the Africa part of this thing, percentage-wise, I could hold it on my fingers. Central Africa is about that far, see? Big, long. I looked at that and I says, hell, we'll worry about that when we get there. He was exactly right. Because Central Africa, the jungles, the hot, moist jungles of Central Africa, there's only one other place on planet Earth where the storms are more vicious, and that's the Amazon basin. And any of you that have flown down there and knows that you talk about rain showers, wow, they know about that a lot. And it's the same thing. In fact, in Central Africa, the equatorial trade winds that we were running around the world towards the west with tailwinds, when those huge thunderstorms get going, the equatorial trade winds blow those things out over the Atlantic, and they turn into hurricanes. And those same trade winds that we're flying would carry turn into big hurricanes or typhoons, bad weather, right? And they ravage our southeastern coast of America. But those were right there where those Hummers form. And at that time, we started climbing and climbing and climbing. And here's a non-pressurized airplane. It started the front engine again, to hell with range. And I'm seeing all these thunderstorms going all over. And the agony of the airplane that goes so bloody slow. Oh, God.
What airspeed most of the trip?
Not too technical, but the optimum speed to fly, L over D, max is what they call it. But when it's heavy, that thing is shifted to the right, and you got to go faster to fly that. Every pound that you burn fuel off, that thing gets slower and slower and slower and slower. So about halfway around the world, we'd be looking at maybe 42 knots indicated.
42 knots?
42 knots indicated. Now, if you got halfway around the world and you got birds going by laughing, the agony of that was horrible. And the only way to deal with that, I kept thinking, God, look at this speed. I look up there, 2 thunderstorms. And then I start heading between them, trying to climb between them. And before I get there, they start joining hands. So then I got to turn around and fly back and fly another one. There was a good part of the time on Africa that W was not anywhere near the top of the compass. and in and out of those things and higher and higher. And we didn't turn our oxygen up high enough, and both of us became severely hypoxic. For another reason, we had checked our oxygen requirements for high altitude, but we were rested. We're feeling fine. Did it in Mojave. Made a little chart instead of taking an SPO gauge that tells what your blood oxygen saturation is. So I had this little chart. Okay, that was going to save us 1.5 pounds because I made a paper chart. Didn't need this little thing in my finger. We made a chart. If you're 18,000 feet, you look at the chart. Gina needs 3.2 liters per minute, and Dick needs twice that, I guess. But she could go to 19,000 feet before she even needed oxygen. And so anyway, I depended on that, but we didn't know that the fact that if you're tired, that the ability for the blood to transfer the oxygen to the lungs, they'd call it hypemic hypoxia. And boy, were we in deep oxygen deficit. And the thing is that I needed that oxygen, and I didn't know what the next week was going to handle. More high altitude, more icing that we had to deal with.
Or the next 5 minutes?
Or the next 5 minutes, yeah. But anyway, I stayed religiously on that chart, and it was really a bad thing to do. And it's one of those demand oxygen controllers from the medical industry. You breathe in, turn the light on. So I put 2 little LEDs up on the instrument panel. You talk about a Pavlovian response. It's really cool. You breathe in, turn the light on. Breathe in, turn the light on. How many of you use the demand oxygen controllers? They're really a cool thing. They squirt oxygen in your nose only when you're breathing in, not out. And so you can extend the use of the oxygen a lot. So I breathe in, turn the light on. And if you do that for a couple, 3 hours, it's Pavlovian response. You can be down here doing something else, and you breathe in, and peripherally you see that damn light come on. And I could do the same for Gina, too. I would monitor her, whether she was getting oxygen. But
How did you get over the mountains?
You know, I don't know. I do not know how we got over it, and I'll tell you why I don't know. We were going higher and higher, and we were going through this, besides these vicious storms all around. We'd try to go into an area, and then we'd turn around, and your heart would leap, and you say, my way out. You've all been in that. The people that fly, you turn around, the weather's worse behind you than it is ahead of you, and your heart sinks, and you got that really horrible feeling. And it's bad enough, but this airplane, you just touch the edge of one of those thunderheads, and the airplane will disintegrate. The mission will end in the jungles of Central Africa, and nobody will ever have a clue about what happened, even if they ever find you. And so more than once, and I was trying to climb higher and higher and higher as I could get. And then we started to hallucinate. Gina had passed out. She was no longer conscious. Her skin was cold and clammy. And I would shake her. I could feel her skin was cold. And then all of a sudden she would explode into consciousness and didn't know where she was. And her eyes would dart back and forth. There's a scientific word for that, when your eyes dart back and forth. And then pretty soon, I'm in bad shape too. And all of a sudden the instrument panel started blowing out like a big beach ball. And so I'm holding it, see, with one hand. And I'm saying, Gina, help me. Look at this thing. It's blowing out. Well, when you start to hallucinate that bad, you know you're in bad trouble for hypoxia. But the problem with hypoxia, it is an insidious onset. And it's kind of a euphoric effect. It's kind of like a cheap drunk. So if you have an onset that's kind of sneaky and it's kind of pleasurable, well, you can set yourself up in some pretty bad time. But anyway, to answer your question, the next thing that I can remember in doing this book, I was trying for the life of me to find out how we got out of these horrible situations to 6,000 feet with no clouds, perfectly smooth, and cruising out over Western Africa. And I have no conscience of that at all. Absolutely none of how we got there.
Well, you finally did get there, and you got back across the Atlantic, back to Edwards, and you land, right?
Right.
What, 9 days,
3 minutes and 44 seconds.
40 seconds, right? Worth it?
Well, of course. It was worth it. For 5.5 years, I maintained the motivation. What would it feel like to have accomplished this mission? And because I thought that would feel pretty good, I used that as a motivational device. In fact, it was just barely capable of keeping us going for that 5.5 years. And then we landed at Edwards. Had to beat up the field a little bit too. But what are they going to do to me? I'm Dick Rutan, and we just flew around the world. Nobody's going to get mad at us. So we flew. All these people, tens of thousands of people, come out to see us. They just didn't want to see an airplane land.
The tower? What was your exchange with the tower when you came back in?
Well, before I could see the Edwards complex and that nice runway, even though Bert told me that there's all the people and the press was there and people were lined up way back into Lancaster, it didn't even permeate. The only thing I really cognizant of is that it's a restricted area. Now, I've gone in the restricted area 6 times at Edwards, but it was always on the invitation of a word called Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And I thought, there's nothing wrong with this airplane. But then this horrible thought is if they won't let us in the restricted area and they won't let us land at Edwards because they're busy and they don't want to mess around with some home-built airplane, then I got to do this whole thing over again. And so I was going to plead with the tower operator to please let us in, and he'd feel sorry for me. And I says, I'm 20 minutes south, and I know you're busy, and I don't want to interfere with any of your traffic. But if you just clear me in and let me land on a remote area of the dry lake, I'd really appreciate that. And he comes back and he says, Voyager 1, this is Edwards Tower. Sir. He's confused. He says, sir, we have canceled flying for today, and we're all here waiting for your return. And I was flabbergasted. They canceled flying? I mean, these are multi-billion-dollar military programs by Lockheed and Boeing and stuff. I'm a little home built from some little out-of-the-way town in Mojave 20 miles away. Who would care? But then there was an undercast, and I couldn't see. And right at the edge of the restricted area, at 8,000 foot on top, all of a sudden the overcast ended. And I looked down, and I saw that hallowed ground where Chuck Yeager and Scott Crossfield chased the demons in the sky. To us, that is aviation's hallowed ground, the Muroc Edwards complex. That's where all the big stuff was done. And I looked on the western dry lake, and there was tens of thousands of people who crowded into the western dry lake. And I thought, I could not believe it. They came out here for us, and I was flabbergasted. But we finally got down, and they wanted me to fly an extra 30 minutes so I could have an even 9 days. I thought that sounded better. Anyway, we did a bunch of low approaches and buzzed the crowd. And I wanted to let the crowd listen to those little engines that puttered its way slowly around the world. And another thing is a tribute of thanks, because Bert and Gina and I, we didn't do this. We had all kinds of experts that came and did this. It was a total team effort. And then when time is up, Gina put the gear down, and we came down and landed on aviation's hallowed ground, taxied up to that news place. And before I landed, I looked at all its press agencies, all its press cameras all over the place, and I thought, Dick, you better not screw this up, because you'll never be able to buy all that film from them. We touched down and rolled up in front of the crowd. They stayed away so the inspector can come and remove the barographs and
the FAA guy.
The FAI guy.
FAI,
the Federation of Aeronautica International. They were going to homologate and certify that record. And boy, I wanted that done. I didn't want 8 chances on that thing. And then while they were doing that, when the engines were finally shut down, I closed my eyes and put my head back, and just for a handful of time, and I realized that it felt every bit as good as I'd always imagined it for 5.5 years.
Wow. How does it, yeah. Wow. What's it feel like to join the Wright brothers, Doolittle, Lindbergh, Yeager, to name just a few of the iconic, people of aviation?
One of them.
And realize that you're in that handful of names.
It's very humbling, and I'll tell you what happened. There's another person you want to add to that list, Lieutenant Lee Wade.
Why?
You know who Lieutenant Lee Wade? Anybody know? Raise your hand. You know who Lieutenant Lee Wade is. Lieutenant Lee Wade flew the first airplane, the Douglas World Cruisers, around the world in 1924. And when we enshrined the airplane in the National Air and Space Museum, in attendance was Lieutenant Lee Wade. And here's the guy that did it first, period, and the same guy that did it nonstop some, I don't know, years and years later. And what an honor it was to him. But this thing about celebrity status, and to me, I guess I'm like nobody else. Oh man, I'm Dick Rutan. I flew around the world and I'm this big celebrity and people, whatever. And it started to go to my head. And the neatest thing happened. And I think that God put this person in the line that day to take care of Dick, hopefully. And he come up and we're selling the beautiful poster for $10. And I was autographing them all morning, taking. And this individual come up, and he's a young guy, and he come up and he looked at me and he looked at the poster and he says, "Yeah, it's really a nice poster." He says, "How much is it?" And I told him, and he says, "Yeah," he thought about it and he says, "Yeah, I think I'll buy one." And I'm standing there, you know what I'm saying? "Well, do you want it autographed?" And he looked at me and he looked all around. And he said something, God love him. He looked all around and he said, "Autographed by who?" Oh my God. That knocked the wind out of my sails, and hopefully it brought me down to humility again. And I never forget that, about what an honor it is to do that.
What's the title of your book?
When I'm writing the book, I realized that there had been, how many times there had been, when I was looking down a runway or looking out of a cockpit, or coming out of North Vietnam on fire, or the balloon ruptured and we had to bail out, or crashing at the North Pole, or some of the real wild combat missions that I'd been involved in, or flight tests. At the end of the runway doing some weird thing, or some weird airplane. And what I was thinking about at that time, I wonder what the next 5 minutes is going to be like. And I says, "Hey, that sounds like a name of a book." And so it's all based on kind of the life and times of the next 5 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dick Rutan.